So I'd like to start today with a question. Who is someone in your life who had a positive influence on you? Who helped you to grow? Mother. Parents come to mind pretty quick. Who else? Dave. Your husband. Spouse. Your sister or brother. Aunt. Aunt or uncle. Yeah, absolutely. A friend. Who else?
Grandparents.
Grandparents. Father.
Children.
Children.
Teachers.
Teachers. Absolutely.
Their first boss.
Your first boss.
Every club.
People in the workplace. Yep. All of these people formed us in some way, big or small. And they had some kind of power or influence over us. And yet they used that for good. For the past several weeks, we've been talking about what it means to be Christian in community. What does it look like to be Christian in community? How does Christian judgment, Christian speech, Christian treatment of others, Christian love, Christian sharing, how does that look like? There are a couple of qualities that I think have come up as we've discussed this theme together. One is openness. Being open to those who are new, to those who are different. Our judgment should be merciful. Our inclusion of others should be generous. Another quality that has come up is mindfulness. That we would be mindful of our speech and our treatment of others. That we would think about how what we say and do builds up or tears down our community. That we'd be thoughtful about how we speak and how we act and the impact that has on other people. And the other quality that came to mind is connectedness. As we talked about 2 weeks ago, it is not good for human beings to be alone. We're made to live in community. We have the power to reach out to those who have been pushed away. We have the power to lift up those that have been pushed down. When we do these things, when we live in this way, with openness, with mindfulness, with connectedness, we make space for God's presence in the world and in our communities, in our families, in our workplace. But we're not perfect, right? This won't happen all the time. Sometimes we're going to fall short. I know there are times when I have not been thoughtful. Times when I have not been open-minded. Times when I have been cut off from other people. We're not the first to fall short, as we see in our gospel story. This gospel story, it's interesting that we have these 4 gospels. They each paint a different portrait of Jesus and his followers. They give us a different perspective on Jesus' ministry, his life, his death, his resurrection. And in Mark's gospel, we don't really get the good side of the disciples. They come across as petty, argumentative, and they also come across as kind of thick, a little slow to understand what Jesus is trying to say. At the very beginning of our gospel today, Jesus lays everything out for them about what's about to happen in the near future. They're walking the path towards Jerusalem, towards the cross. He's preparing them for the events on the horizon, that he'll be handed over, that he'll be condemned, that he'll be spat upon, mocked, and finally killed. And what's the next thing that they have to say? Yeah, Jesus, we want you to do something for us. Never mind that you just told us it's all about to end. We've got a favor to ask. And Jesus, he's very patient in this particular instance. Jesus isn't always patient with the disciples, but here he's patient. He invites them to tell what their request is. He listens to James and John. And they say, we would like to sit at your left and at your right when you're in your glory. Now, when I imagine this, Jesus in his glory, I always think of after he's risen and he's ascended to the Father and he's in heaven on his heavenly throne. And James and John, they want to sit on either side of this heavenly throne. That's what's always been in my head. But that's not what's in the disciples' head. Despite the fact that he's just said he's about to be handed over, to be treated horribly, and to be killed, they still think that he's going to be the next king of Israel. He's going to conquer those Romans. He's going to sit on an earthly throne. And they want to have his left ear and his right ear. They want to be the advisors. They want to have access to that earthly power. Jesus is so patient. He says, you don't understand what you're asking. And he talks about the cup that he's to drink, the baptism with which he's been baptized, which he will be baptized. And what he's talking about here is not the earthly throne or the heavenly throne. It's the cross, the passion. And there will be somebody on his left and on his right when he's on the cross. But that's not for him to choose. And it won't be James and John. And he has to tell the disciples, you know what? Maybe he would not wish it for them, but he knows that after he dies and he's risen and the disciples continue his ministry, they too will experience persecution, just like he did. They'll drink the cup that he drank. They'll be baptized with the baptism with which he was baptized. It's not quite what they envisioned. It wasn't exactly how they imagined power in the kingdom that God was creating on earth. What does power look like in God's kingdom? Well, what does power look like in our world today? Does it look much different than what Jesus describes of the Gentile leaders? Those who have power, lord it over others. Those who have power are tyrants over others. We look at the news, countries around the world. Are those in power much different than they were back then? Now, not everybody, right? Not everybody necessarily follows this model, but many. Enough that we can nod our heads and say, yeah, it's not much different. It's not much different at all. So what would power look like in God's community? We have this vivid picture that's depicted in the Old Testament reading. What images did you hear in that reading? Do you remember? It talked about a suffering servant. One who would be despised, rejected. And yet, because the sacrifice was made on behalf of others, would be lifted up by God, exalted. named. Parents, teachers, uncles, aunts, siblings, friends, co-workers. Were they like that suffering servant? Maybe their suffering wasn't as graphic as in that image. Often we think of the suffering servant as Jesus, and Jesus thought of himself in that way. But the image goes further. It doesn't stop with Jesus. We too are called to make sacrifice, to use our power, to lift up, to gather in. Now maybe you're thinking to yourself, I don't have much power, Pastor. I'm not a CEO, not a representative. I'm not sitting at the left and the right hand. But if you're a parent or a spouse, if you're a consumer or a voter, if you're a sibling or a friend, a co-worker, you have influence over other people. You do have power. And you have the power to use that influence to do good, to lift up and gather in, just as Jesus does for us. Lift us up, gather us in. Even if it's in a small way, for one person, it could make a huge difference. The people who you remember, they probably didn't think they were going too far out of their way. But it made a huge difference for you. We talked about these traits of living like Christians in community, being open, being mindful, being connected. I'd like to add one more. Being humble. Now, not in the sense that you're down on yourself or self-critical, but that you're keeping a perspective that everything you've been given, the power, the goods, the relationships, a home, a family, everything you've been given, keeping in that in mind that it's from God and that it's meant to be stewarded, used, shared generously, just as God shares with us generously. And though we won't succeed all the time at living into that perfect vision, when we do get it right, in those moments, we will glimpse God's kingdom.